Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
As we move into 1985, we were looking at a problem that's still with us from 1984. During our last calendar year, we heard much about the problem of hunger in the world, and particular emphasis has been given to the starvation that's taken place in Ethiopia. We thought it most appropriate that we start out early in 1985 with discussing this very important problem. And also I want to commend the student government at North Idaho College, who has been involved recently and is continuing to be involved in raising funds to help those who are in dire need in relation to the world, particularly Ethiopia. I have asked to come to our program a longtime friend and a person that I admire very much to deal with this very important subject. I would like to welcome to our program Mr. Paul Edwards. Mr. Edwards resides in our area now, but he's had a tremendous wealth of experience with the United Nations in international questions such as hunger. In fact, he is the former Director of Information for the United Nations, UNICEF, known today as United Nations Children's Fund. Paul, it's a very special privilege on my part to welcome you today to discuss this very, very important topic.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll continue with questions in a minute, but it's just a special privilege to get a chance to talk with someone who not only has this expertise, but has the care that you do. And thank you for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Also, I want to welcome to the program, as I did the other day, but I want to emphasize again, a panel member who's been with me from almost the beginning, Mary Lou Reed, and she's taken off 6 months, which I call a sabbatical, when she ran for state office. In fact, she is a newly elected state senator to the Idaho legislature, and I will ask Senator Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. It's wonderful to be back. Paul, would you set the background for us by describing this rather terrible situation in Ethiopia? What is the chief cause of the famine, and what is really going on there?
It's an intensification of a problem that's ever present, Lou. It's first place, get a kind of a picture of Ethiopia. It's out on the Horn of Africa. It's a high desert. Much of the country is not arable. It has a poverty level that's historic. The land is been worn out by centuries and centuries of abuse and overuse. Like many area country in the world, sheep and goats are the answer to disaster. They destroy more than they eat, and they will eat any area of the world, given a lack of control, into absolute poverty. Anyhow, there's 35 million approximately in Ethiopia people. At the present time, the best estimates we have run between 7.5 to 9 million people who are in dire circumstances, and the word cannot be borne down on too heavily. It's a picture that it's been on this earth before. We've seen it in the Sahel, the northern part of Africa. That whole band across there for about 5 years has been more or less in this terrible drought circumstance. That, added to the unproductivity and the drying up of the wells, has made for a tragedy of certain. I don't suppose there's been anything comparable with it in this century in terms of numbers.
Well, what is the government of Ethiopia trying to do for the people? Is it a government that is taking control, or is it just kind of happening?
You have to realize that Ethiopia was an area that was within 10 years has been through a terrific revolution. The old Emperor Haile Selassie was actually thrown out of office on the strength of an earlier famine just 10 years ago. They just celebrated their 10th anniversary. And largely the thing on which that revolution was predicated was his failure to cope with that famine in that time, though the estimated numbers of deaths fell to below 1 million, or around 1.5 million. You see, you can never use an exact figure in these circumstances, because the secondary deaths that spin off the malnutrition circumstances, and then the very often after this sort of thing, the presence of dead bodies and and the general sanitation levels tend to produce epidemics that follow on the field of this terrible hunger.
And they also don't keep very good track of the numbers, as I understand.
They do not. They cannot. These things, all these things that we think about as being so essential to our Western world have no validity in that world. Statistics are a humbug. Even the best of the third world countries' statistics must always be called into question. This particular situation, there is a military dictatorship in there. A committee of generals took over, and they have been Marxist in their orientation, though I think it's an oversimplification to attribute this to their political philosophy. This is much deeper. The fact that they didn't make the gains they hoped for in these 10 years, I don't think you can attribute that entirely to their presence, but they did engage in some very foolish things. For example, they've spent more on armament in the last 3 years each year than was their gross national product to be exported. They had recently, of all things, they wanted to glorify the revolution, as so often happens, and they had a celebration that cost them something like $100 million of the revolution. This at the time that the people are in great jeopardy. So you can't say that it was that the country's been handled with great finesse. There is, I've worked a lot in the third world, and any time you start to make governmental judgments, you have to remember that independence and self-reliance is a very brief experience with these people. And they did not come into these positions. Very often the bureaucrats that had been trained by the colonials came into power with great pomp and circumstance, and in about 3 years' time the staff sergeants who'd been on the army says, what's propping this guy up except me? And they march in, and the fellow who is a sergeant major becomes a marshal overnight, and he heads up the nation. Well, that's the kind of government you get, and so this is true of Ethiopia as well.
Thank you.
Paul, I know that you worked for the United Nations for 25 years, and during that time you had a number of positions, and I indicated that you were the former director of information for UNICEF, but you also traveled in many parts of the world during those years, and not many people in our area would have the knowledge that you would of not only Ethiopia but the whole world. I really would like to get into two parts. First of all, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about some statistics which should be of great concern to us all concerning hunger all over the world. You have really, I think, got to our conscience with talking about Ethiopia alone, some 7.5 to 9 million people who are really starving. But when you've spread that throughout the world, particularly the African countries, what kind of statistics are we talking about? How many people are in deep trouble?
You have to, it is UNICEF's estimate based upon about 25, 30 years of pretty intimate experience with these circumstances in the country, that approximately 40% of the people of the world are in a period of deep malnutrition. I'm not talking about being short of vitamin C or vitamin D, or in the case of vitamin E, blindness. I'm talking about just a total way below what we think almost survival rates.
And those people are not going to survive if something is not done.
They will not survive. They are in jeopardy, and only the best of circumstances will pull them through. Particularly vulnerable are the aged and the children. It is not unusual in this situation of Ethiopia for mothers and fathers or whoever left of a family to just walk out of a village and leave the children to starve in the circumstance. It would be more merciful to put the child to death. That's a kind of a harsh statement. But you know, Tony, the fact is that our world, this comfortable, wonderful world of ours out here, we fortunate few, we don't really have any sense of what lies ahead of us in terms of the kind of seemingly cruel actions that the world holds for us in the time ahead. You know, I live here and I love it and enjoy it, and every once in a while I get settled back into a nice sense of normalcy in this situation, and then along comes a newsreel, that dates me, a television show, like we've seen out of Ethiopia, and I die 1,000 deaths because that's the real world, not us. We live in a circumstance so out of relationship with the pain and the hunger and the disease that characterizes the mass of people in the world, that it makes it very difficult for us. And once in a while a thing comes along like this, so vivid and so deep in its emotional impact, that it stirs our conscience into operation, and we go into a sort of a frenzy of action, and that's commendable. I certainly respect everything that everybody's doing. But then I look at the other end of it. I've administered these programs in Bangladesh and Pakistan and in Biafra in Africa. And I know some of the circumstances that prevail and how difficult it is to administer this on the ground. Somebody said to me, have you handled these famines? And I said, nobody ever handles a famine. You work at it, you don't deal with it, it deals with you. And you get food to a port. I remember getting 30,000 tons of rice to East Pakistan one time during a famine. I got it as far as the harbor. We had the reserve in Thailand, which used to be an exporting rice country. And we got it to Chittagong, which is a port about 400 miles south of Dhaka, in the area where the famine was. And I thought I had all the arrangements made and flew back to my office in Karachi and got a cable to get right back. The ship had paid a bribe to the men who were unloading the ship, and we got the rice off. But the railroad men would not move the rice until they had received a bribe, bakshish. I was furious. I went to the head of the state, a man named Fazlul Hook, a tremendous, great 300-pound man, and raised as much hell as you can with the head of a state. And that's a delicate thing, too, because he's a man of significance. But then he got the money up to pay the bakshish, the payoff to the railroad men. And, of course, I was kind of outraged at this idea. And he said, Mr. Edwards, you forget that these men's pay is a result of inflation in the country and the price of rice. Their families are starving, too. And their chance to get some money to feed their family depends on getting some money out of this situation so we can move this up where the other 50 million people are.
So the whole thing is so caught up in not only climatic conditions, but political conditions. So you're fighting so many fronts at once.
And then, I looked at the statistics. I took the trouble to look up the encyclopedia book that I have for 1983. And they estimated there were 13,000 trucks in operation in this country, which is as big as both Texas and Montana combined. There was 13,000 trucks, but of the 13,000, only 6,000 of them were operative because of a lack of spare parts. How many times we've had the situation where we have food within, let's say, 30, 50 kilometers, 20 to 30 miles from the source where people are dying of famine, and there's no way to move it. The trucks are broken down or the gasoline is all gone, and a spare part is missing, so a lorry that's scheduled to go a community can't go, and so then you have to round up a group of men and break down the sacks to less than 30 pounds because they're so weak they can't carry a sack 30 kilometers. It'll take them 2 to 3 days, but they carry it in on their heads.
In addition to the trucks breaking down and so forth, you've indicated to me also that the transportation system doesn't even reach a lot of the starving people, so there's no transportation other than carrying it.
Absolutely not. I jotted down the total number of roads in that when I was looking it up. In the whole of that country, there is only 450 miles of railroad. That runs up from the sea up to Addis Ababa. It's a one-track thing, one train a day, one each way. And that thing huffs and puffs and makes it some days, and some days it doesn't, because the spare parts will hang it up. The total road system in the area is less than 13,000 miles. In an area the size of Texas and mine, that's every road.
So people can be within 40, 45 miles of a system and still die.
And they're dying. One of the problems they're having with this thing in Ethiopia, Charlton Heston just reported today. I saw him, he just got back. He'd been sent there by President Reagan. And he reported this noon on the tube, this being the 10th of December, he reported that one of the great problems was that the death rate in the camps was because people arrived there in such a state of exhaustion that often they arrived with dead children, or they died as a result of total fatigue and exhaustion before they could even take what meager supplies are in those camps.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest is Mr. Paul Edwards, who was with the United Nations for 25 years, and he is the former Director of Information for UNICEF. I will ask Mary Lou Reed to continue the questioning.
Well, Paul, I don't know if there really are any solutions, but I think maybe we can go a little further, push a little farther into what are the central issues. You started out by saying that sheep and goats are perhaps really way up there in terms of culprits. If we were looking for solutions, long-term solutions, the question is not so much is there enough food to go around, is there, as much as what can we do to make sure that there would be food in the future that would be there for the people who are there. Do you want to talk a little bit about land management reform?
Yes, I think it's very important. In this particular part of the world, irrigation of the areas that are arable and where water could be affected, but you're talking about capital investment. And you're talking about capital investment either by outsiders, because there's almost no domestic capital of any substance. This is another problem that we in the West have with many of the formulas we prescribe for these terribly dependent countries. They do not generate enough capital to get into the kind of things on which their redemption is predicated. Once you start to put in irrigation of the type that would seriously affect the population of 35 million, you're talking money. Now, Ethiopia was never a colonial, never occupied. It had a history of independence, save for a brief time when the Italians were in there during World War II in the early years. One of the things that the colonials did in the course of administration, for example, India, where the British were, India had more irrigated land than any other country in the world, and these irrigation ditches were greater than any other country. You never think of this when you talk about colonialism, but that was true of railroads as well.
So one of the blessings of colonialism.
It was one of the blessings of colonialism. It was irrigation and transportation, two very key items on which Indians have been able to do some building and with some success. Only some, because population remains a tremendous problem. This is another thing that we're not willing to face, is the hard decisions with regard to family planning. In UNICEF, we finally succeeded in getting nations to accept, as part of the UNICEF programs, population control and planning. But this was a battle against a weird combination of forces. Very often it was the church or the Catholic countries like Belgium, France, Switzerland, and of all things, the Russians opposed it. It's an amazing thing to find the Vatican and the Russians coming into an agreement. And the odd part of it was the Vatican used economics as their basis for opposition rather than morality, and the Russians turned to morality. I'll never forget this. The session was in Addis Ababa that this happened. And we had to postpone this part of our program for a year. But ignorance, poverty, the link between the two, and then the whole role of women in these areas. In Africa, you can figure that 80% of the food in Africa is produced by women. This on top of the childbearing chores and all they do the field work, and then they come in at night and they're responsible. And if they don't do it well, their husbands beat them. I mean, they're little more than domestic animals in terms of the chores that are assigned to them as part of it. I don't mean that every African husband is a brute. I'm not saying that. But it's a hard, cruel society, and the place of women is just really tragic. I always remember that session in Addis Ababa, because that is where, for the first time, the UNICEF board did not turn down, but they did not come into agreement on family planning, which is so closely related to hunger, because population is the root factor in all population and poverty. And when it was through, an African delegate, a wonderful man named Aransi Jones, who was the delegate from Nigeria, he made a speech that I'll never forget, because he said to the assembled delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I know that this is a sad decision for Africa because we face a terribly painful century. But he said, you know, you had asked me to believe that in France and Belgium the population growth and ratio is predicated upon personal absence in accordance with the doctrine of the church. He said, I went to school there. You can't convince me of that. Then he went on to say, he said, you know, first came the soldiers, and then came the merchants, and then came the missionaries, and then came medicine, and then came methodology, but methodology was late. And he said, one of the tragic things was that you caused us to lose all our belief in our gods before we understood yours. I have never forgotten that sentence. To me, it's a profound statement of why we are so out of sync in dealing with a country like that. We have to respect their cultures, shape them, move them gently, move them slowly and with many tears sometimes. Sometimes a famine like this or a great national tragedy enables to make you leaps in doing and affecting things that you never could do if you had to run into all the holdbacks that come from the old men and the old patrons of the place. But a tragedy like this gives us really an opportunity. If you understand what I mean, you can all of a sudden you break through barriers that are old, centuries old in customs, because necessity has, and the tragedy of the situation has overwhelmed the significance of the power of this old power group. So I'm hoping that as you're talking about what to do to restore it, it's got to be a 20-year program. It has to involve more than the United States. It must be a work of all the Western powers. If we're to avoid this kind of, or lessen, we can't avoid it. I expect there'll be repetitions of this within 5 years someplace in Africa or elsewhere. But if we're to cope with it, it involves interdependence of nations. It involves the international conscience. It means working together. We in America have a hard time accepting the UN flag because we're such a big power, and the struggle between us and Russia for dominance always tends to belittle in a way the significance of the United Nations. But there are some things having to do with the World Health Organization, with the Food and Agricultural Organizations, with the United Nations Children's Fund, in which our nation must blend its efforts in with the rest of the world if we're to be effective in approaching these problems on a long-range basis.
And has the UN been active in this particular area in attempting to show people how they can restore the land?
Very definitely. This is part of the work of the Food and Agricultural Organization. It's part of the International Development Agency. I have handled these programs in Asia in my day, and I'm thinking of Bangladesh. And not always successful. I always remember Paul Hoffman. You remember him? He was a great man. He was head of Studebaker, and one time he had a quorum of newspapermen from all over the world to discuss international development and these programs. And the man from the London Times said, "Mr. Hoffman, I'm sad to say that I made a review on an international basis of our staff around the world, and their report to us is that 35 to 40% of your projects are failures." And Paul Hoffman stopped a minute and he said, "Well, that's rather encouraging. That is to say that 60 to 65% of our programs are successful. And given the circumstance in which we work, in the areas in which we work, and the magnitude of the problems, I cannot feel bad over that percentage." And that's something we as Americans must learn to accept. We have a tremendous national drive for a quick fix. We like to define a problem and solve it, in quotation marks, you know. Mm-hmm. This is not something that lends itself to, it doesn't, even the questions aren't answered easy, let alone the answers, you know. It's going to try the patience, it's going to try the endurance, the tolerance, and the understanding of what we're up against. And very often I become angry with our politicians who find every occasion to shorten the tolerance of Americans, you know, the deploring of this aid to these countries, and why are we doing this in Upper Slobovia? Why are we, you know, these things are part of a world that travels at 600 miles an hour, that shoots men to the moon, that makes communications such as we're engaged in go around the world in the fifth of a second. If you think you can successfully separate yourself from the rest of this world, you're whistling Dixie. Believe me, you're off key to boot.
Paul, there is another area that we want to get into with our viewers. Oftentimes, so many people who are so well-meaning and they want to assist, because of lack of information that they have, unfortunately you do have the information, they might try to help and not be successful. I'm speaking of the kind of things that are nutritious and things that are not. And so in fund drives that are made, I was very impressed by your comment of the mayor of Jerusalem, who was trying to be very helpful and was not successful. Would you instruct us on what to watch out for, what kind of food is not going to solve the problem, and how we should go about this?
It's a very real problem, Tony, because you have people with great and good meaning. For example, right in our own country at the present time, the wheat farmers with their surpluses are making a magnificent gesture of putting wheat in position for this. I look at it and I feel saddened because I know that wheat cannot reach Ethiopia in less than 9 months. And I know that when it arrives there, the port may be clogged to where a ship will sit with 3 months on it, because at that time, all over the world, these are stirrings. And unless something is done on a great international scale to assist, you're going to have circumstances like we had in Biafra, where Mayor Culloch gathered food from England and whoever would put into it and sent a ship to Biafra. It got there and we had to offload it on the island where we were supplying that country, and we were shipping it in by night by plane because they were attacked. The Nigerian government was attacking their planes if they tried to make it in the daytime, so that only the highest priority foods and medicines went in. UNICEF at that time was providing a mixture of what they called CMS2. It was corn and soya meal and powdered milk with vitamins added. It was 100% nutritious. It dealt with nutrition, you see, and it was also, and we had codfish, dried codfish that we'd brought from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. So you'd get that flown into the country, and you'd get a great big trough or pot, and you'd cook a batch of that up and throw a few of those cod in there. You had a highly nutritious and important meal to eat. On the other hand, Teddy Culloch, the mayor of Jerusalem, he'd collected everything from custard puddings to camel soup to, this sort of thing, 94% water, right? When it arrived at the island, the officials on the island said, no way, we won't fly this stuff because we must give priority to what is life-saving. So the stuff sat there on the island, and in the hot tropical sun, it rotted and burst and what have you. And I remember a Time correspondent came through and came back and wrote a very critical story in the press about UNICEF goods rotting and exploding on the island. And we were in charge of the island, but it was not our stuff. And the reason it was done was because it bore no relationship to the tremendous. I am pleased to see that the stuff they're taking to Ethiopia has a priority, and I would advise most people, instead of paying 94 cents for a can of this to send on some sort of a drive, send 50 cents cash, because they're closer to the market, they're closer to the dietary habits of the people, they know where the supplies are within a reasonable movable distance. Otherwise, the only thing that I can foresee is that we make a massive move of our military equipment and join with the Soviets. In this, they've moved a lot of vehicles in there in recent times. But the Americans, if we had some of our landing craft, and I think Charlton Hest referred to that today too, if we had some of those huge helicopters that we use in Vietnam and stuff like that, otherwise there's no way of getting to these places in time.
I'm so sorry we're out of time, but you've been very, very informative, and on behalf of Lou and our staff, we thank you so much for coming and serving us so well with your information.
Thank you, Tony. It's a privilege.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Paul Edwards, who's the former Director of Information at UNICEF, talking about the very serious problem of hunger in the world. I thank him for coming, and Mary Lou Reed for her questions. Please have a good week, and be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.